The orchestrated erasure of Anne Boleyn. A psychological and political execution. It is a disturbing truth that for several seconds, possibly up to 30, a decapitated human head can remain aware. In that brief and grotesque sliver of time, the eyes may blink, the mouth may try to form words, and the brain clings to fading consciousness. For Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, and arguably the most famous executed queen in English history, this chilling reality may have been her final experience. Yet, her death was far more than a single swift sword stroke. It was a masterclass in psychological destruction and political stagecraft. While sanitized history textbooks often state that Anne Boleyn was executed for treason, the true nature of her death was not just judicial, it was ceremonial obliteration. Her execution was the concluding scene of a ruthless campaign not only to end her life but to annihilate her legacy. It was the Tudor state's attempt to make Anne disappear, not only from the throne but from memory. By May 19, 1536, Anne had endured 17 harrowing days, confined within the Tower of London, the very place where, just 3 years earlier, she had awaited her coronation. Once a queen in triumph, she now found herself in a state of psychological torment. Each day her execution was postponed, stretching her anguish into an ordeal of uncertainty. Delaying a death sentence was not mercy, it was torment, a calculated strategy to grind down the prisoner's resolve. Henry VIII had spared no theatrics in orchestrating her death. Rather than allowing her to die by the English executioner's axe, a method known for its grim inefficiency, he summoned an expert swordsman from Calais. This choice is often portrayed as merciful, but in truth, it only heightened the spectacle. Anne would die not at the hands of her own countrymen, but by a foreigner wielding a gleaming sword, alien and cold. Witnesses noted that Anne's demeanor in her final hours was eerily calm. Some described her as cheerful, but this apparent serenity was not passive, was psychological disassociation, a detachment from reality often seen in victims of extreme trauma. She made macabre jokes about becoming la reine sans tête, the queen, without a head, masking her terror behind gallows humor. Modern psychology would recognize in her behavior the symptoms of a nervous system overwhelmed by stress, insomnia, detachment, and involuntary emotional numbing. The night before her execution, she reportedly prayed for hours, requesting the sacrament in the early morning hours. Tower guards observed her pacing and whispering, with sleep eluding her entirely. The final cruelty came in the calculated dismantling of Anne's character. She had been accused of ludicrous crimes: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, and plotting to kill the king. These allegations, supported by fabricated evidence and forced confessions, were designed to destroy her public image. The goal was not simply to execute her, but to ensure she died in disgrace. When the moment came, Anne was escorted from her chambers through the Tower, the same route she had taken as queen in 1533. Now she was flanked, not by adoring courtiers but by armed guards. The scaffold erected for her was curiously lonely, 3 feet high and like the towering platforms reserved for noble executions. This forced Anne to descend to the crowd's level, robbing her of dignity even in death. Her execution was a performance intended not only to kill but to degrade. The crowd that had gathered to witness her end was not silent. Contrary to modern depictions of solemn silence, the event resembled a grim festival. Vendors hawked wares, and many in the audience jeered. Anne, labeled a witch and a seductress by the crown's propaganda machine, had become a figure of public ridicule. Anne was permitted a final address. She spoke carefully, praising the king and submitting to the law, though she never confessed guilt. Her words, constrained by political necessity, were not freedom of expression but the opposite, survival-minded censorship. Even in death, Anne had to protect her daughter, Elizabeth, and avoid giving her enemies further ammunition. Henry VIII did not attend. He remained at Whitehall Palace, waiting for news of her death. It is said that even as Anne's head fell, Henry was already celebrating his engagement to Jane Seymour. The message was clear: Anne had become expendable. Her death was a means to an end, specifically the king's obsessive quest for a male heir. The French executioner, specially summoned and handsomely paid, was trained in swift, single-strike beheadings. Unlike English executioners who used axes often, requiring multiple blows, a Calais swordsman had rehearsed his strike, possibly even on animals, to ensure a clean performance. The sword he used was razor-sharp, meant for horizontal slicing, not vertical chopping. But even in its efficiency, the method had its own brand of cruelty. Anne knelt upright in other French tradition with no block to rest her head. She remained perfectly still by force of will alone, blindfolded to prevent her from flinching at the crucial moment. Witnesses observed her lips moving in prayer, her chest rising and falling, her eyes flickering under the cloth as she strained to hear the executioner's footsteps. The waiting was its own form of torment, a silence that screamed. When the sword finally fell, it severed her neck in one stroke. But what came next was the stuff of nightmares. Her eyes blinked, her mouth moved. Some swore she tried to continue praying even after her head was removed. It was the final, horrifying proof of lingering awareness after death. No coffin had been prepared. Her ladies-in-waiting, grief-stricken and traumatized, found an empty arrow chest to place her remains in. She was buried without ceremony in the Chapel of St. Peter, ad Vincula, in an unmarked grave. No headstone, no mass. Not a queen in death, but a discarded object. The erasure of Anne Boleyn did not end with her burial. Her emblems were scraped from palace walls. Her portraits were destroyed. Speaking her name at court could result in banishment or worse. The state turned her into a cautionary tale for women, particularly those who reached above their station. Even her child Elizabeth suffered the fallout. Declared illegitimate and stripped of royal status, she was cast into obscurity. Her household was dissolved. Records show she lacked proper clothing for a child of her birthright. Anne's punishment extended beyond death. It reached into her bloodline. The 5 men executed before and including her brother were killed in rapid succession to build a foundation for her guilt. Their confessions, obtained under duress, were coordinated to prevent contradiction. This was not justice. It was a Tudor show, trial and exercise in absolute power. Wrapped in legal clothing, Anne's execution was meticulously staged. It occurred mid-morning, allowing Londoners time to gather. Church bells tolled upon her death, ringing not for mourning, but as a signal of compliance to the king's will. Her death, private agony turned into public theater, reinforced the authority of the crown. Modern retellings often sanitize Anne's story, framing her final speech as brave, her death as dignified. But the reality was raw and brutal. She was betrayed by the man she had once loved, manipulated by a court that thrived on fear, and systematically destroyed by a political machine that saw her as a threat. Her execution was not simply a moment of personal tragedy. It was a state-sponsored ritual of psychological domination. Anne's severed head became a symbol, not just of a queen's fall, but of how easily truth can be shaped by power. Her death was the culmination of gaslighting. On a national scale, lies were treated as truth, loyalty was punished as treason, and one woman's life was sacrificed to the ambitions of a king who desired control more than companionship. Today, the exact spot of her execution remains uncertain, the memorial marker only an approximation. That uncertainty is symbolic of how history itself has obscured her fate, relocated, reinterpreted, repackaged. But in the silence of Tower Green, the echoes of that morning in May 1536 still whisper, Anne Boleyn was not merely killed, she was erased, and yet, despite every attempt to obliterate her memory, Anne's daughter would one day reign as Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest monarchs. A final irony, and perhaps Anne's quietest victory,